I was saying that we were going to talk about satellites. We talked about satellites yesterday, but really we're going to talk directly about space waste management. You'll see that it's absolutely crazy. I discovered dozens of things. It's a whole universe unto itself that was discussed in passing yesterday, but we'll discover this universe with Christophe BONNAL. Hello, Christophe. You're a senior expert at the Strategy Directorate at CNES. Yes, I am. With you, we have Édouard MERLET. You're the head of the space branch at La Réunion Aérienne et Spatiale. Hello. And Julien CANTEGREIL, you're the CEO of SPACEABLE. You'll explain us what you do exactly. Yes, good morning. To begin with, I'll turn to Christophe. What are we talking about when we're talking about space debris? What does that mean in terms of size or number or historical growth? Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me first. It's always very nice. What's above our heads causes two types of problems that are fairly disconnected from one another, in fact. Up until 650 kilometers is not a problem with debris, it's a problem of clutter, a number of satellites. To give you an example, 10 years ago there were 950 active satellites, now 8,200, in the future 300,000. Talking about tomorrow, 100,000. So tomorrow is 2030. So yes, tomorrow. That's a real problem with traffic management. So space traffic management, as it's called. Not yet debris. No, this is just a highway code of space, trying to avoid that. Who's got right of way? Who's the biggest one? Who's the oldest one? Who's the most expensive? And all that managed at the international level. So that's the first type of issue. The second disconnected type of issue is much higher, above 800 kilometers. 800, 900, 1,000 kilometers. So debris, old big debris from the Cold War years, and that multiplied because of mutual collisions. What were this debris? A couple of satellites, well, 2,000 or 3,000 actually, a couple of thousand. So old satellites that were sent, observation satellites, usually military satellites, also rocket stages that were used to get them up there, that were left up there. And over time they exploded, led to collisions. And that led to a very large population. To give you an idea, there are roughly 36,000 objects, roughly fist-sized. 10,000 objects that have integrity, big stages of satellites. And then you've got 1 million objects of 1 centimeter or 150 million of 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter, it's nothing, but 1 millimeter, it has the same impact as a bowling ball at 100 kilometers an hour. So our fragile satellites, imagine what that causes. So a millimeter-sized object, it may be catastrophic, and 1 centimeter will kill a satellite anyway. 10 centimeters, not only it will kill it, but it generates future debris that will only cause more collisions. So these are the two areas that are disconnected, but that all are based on a foundation, which is our priority right now. It's to know what is above our heads, because really being able to characterize them, being able to track this rampant evolution and increase, we need resources, telescopes, radars, lasers, to improve our catalog and be able to predict the risks and identify risks, identify them better, because right now, to give you an idea, when there's a collision risk between two objects that are both 2 meters in size, we know where they are 200, give or take 200 meters. So there's 99.99% of false alarms. But now we can still live with that. We won't be able to in the future. So that's really our priority, is SST, space surveillance and tracking, which is the big priority. Welcome back to that. First, talking about problem. Édouard, these millions of micro bits of waste, micro debris, is that a problem? And what does that mean in terms of insurance? I'll respond to the context that was very well explained by Christophe. we're looking at what's existing above our heads, but it's important to look at trends, especially in terms of clutter, the development of new space in the last few years. A figure that's always amazed me, if you look at small sats, less than 600 kilos, if you look at the number of small sats that were launched last year, that's roughly 2,300 small sats. Over the last 10 years, it was 8,000. So 30% of small sats launched in the last decade were launched last year. And this is how you'll have so many satellites in 2030. 30,000 to 100,000. Absolutely. And I think the challenge is huge. It's not just about insurance. It's even a challenge for mankind. Now we depend on space applications everywhere in our daily life. With space, we can also observe the Earth. We can harvest data that can only be obtained from space. And so it's essential to keep this environment sustainable, to turn space into a sustainable environment, to keep that in mind. Now, to answer your question about the issues related to these many bits of waste, maybe I can talk about it now, but space insurance, if you look at space insurance, the contribution of premiums on damage, so first party, which is the bulk of our business, premiums are mostly generated by geostationary satellite insurance. If you're not familiar, geostationary satellites weigh several tons, sometimes 10 tons, sent to 36,000 kilometers. They're not really impacted by collision risks. It's really low Earth orbit. And the population in LEO, as it's called, low Earth orbit, is fairly uninsured. Because we were talking about the rise of new space, as I said, that's also explained by how new space is funded. Geostationary satellites are financed by banks that will prescribe insurance, that will ask operators to get insurance to secure funding. On new space, they use different types of funding. These are business models of companies that are bigger risk takers, so they can try to have failures and launch again. So premiums are mostly generated by geostationary satellites. You have growing activity in LEO, so increasing risk of collision, but we insurers don't really have any premiums associated to this rising business of new space. When I say that there's no insurance, it's not that there's no insurance in LEO for some observation satellites that can be insured, but where the challenge seems to be rising is that there are some low Earth orbit satellites that are insured for millions of dollars. So a small collision, as Christophe said, can cause considerable damage on observation technology like mirrors and so on. And that's the future LEO. We know LEO is going to only going to rise. Yes, for operators now, there are some operators that stay on GEO orbits or developing hybrid solutions. So mixing GEO with middle Earth orbit, mixing GEO and LEO. So GEO is not left behind, but the bulk of new activities on LEO, because it's easier to access. So, and you don't make a lot of money, but there's huge risk. Well, we're not just insuring collision risk. Well, that's not our biggest claims. Launch failures, it will depend on the launch vehicle, a breakdown on a subsystem on a satellite. That's the bulk of our claims. So yes, a subsystem fault can be, unfortunately, the consequence of collisions, but then there remains to determine whether it's collision with debris, with micrometeorites. We're coming back to observation difficulties. Is there civil liability in place if your satellite impacts something else? Well, I talked about damage, but we also have civil liability. It's not the bulk of our business. For launch operators and satellite operators, the difficulty right now is that we have no clear liability scheme. If there's a collision between two operating satellites, operators will be warned of the collision risk. They will make informed decisions, but right now there's no right of way or yield signs or stop signs. So both spacecraft can collide. There are no clearly defined rules. And that's an issue for us. There is not possible recourse If you're taking automotive insurance where there can be crashes, well, then you can look for responsibility and liability. Now, when we pay for a satellite that underwent a collision with debris, there's no possible recourse. So this notion of civil liability raises a major issue for me. We can discuss it in a minute, but it's about international consensus on establishing clear rules to develop liability or accountability amongst operators. That's really the notion we need to develop. Julien, before moving on to solutions, your response to this landscape? Well, many things have been said. I would make two comments on LEO that Christophe talked about. First of all, there's very specific physics, singular physics. So you have micrometeorite phenomena, but mostly debris. And the elephant in the room is the sun. The sun has impacts on wear and tear and also changing orbital trajectories and a lot of potential, especially on communications. This is a complicated domain physically. Research is making progress. The probe sent by NASA will reach the sun in 2028 to research the upper atmosphere of the sun. But that's a big impact that we don't know much about. And then regarding congestion, there's the number of spacecraft that you talked about. There's the number of launches. At the Paris Air Show, the US Air Force mentioned an increase from 31 to 92 launches per year in Asia, especially in China, and from 11 to 42 in Europe. So greater number of satellites and launches and more activity. There's now space tourism, people in space. That's one thing, but another essential thing is that we're now going to have critical activities. The war in Ukraine started in space, and ground infrastructure management greatly depends on satellite now. And that's entirely new. So LEO is important for volumes and the criticality of operations. The third thing is that a big part of these critical operations depend exclusively on space segment services. If you have a problem on the space segment, it's all down the drain. For instance, well, what I'm interested in is solar weather. We saw that on a SpaceX launch in February 22. Space weather impact, 52 satellites dead, $100 million impact. So the whole challenge is to create ways and means, ways of behaving. It's not just about legal rule, it's about best practices and standards that are applicable in arbitration litigations, in ISO standards. We need to better understand what Christophe was talking about. So surveillance and tracking, but also solar weather, and create new services to limit risk and ensure risk. Just my hot take. We're now talking about solutions. Do we need a highway code in space, as you called it, Christophe? Do we need a space highway code? What can we do? Well, that's really our priority, the thing that we're working on at the international level. So first of all, establishing rules of non-pollution. Thou shalt not pollute. We've been doing that since 1995, and everybody agrees, everybody swears with their hand on their hearts that they won't pollute, but nobody's doing this. So the basic question is, how can we increase the rate of compliance with international regulations? And there's another fundamental thing that we all agree on, is whatever the rule, anyway, that won't solve the situation. If tomorrow you stopped any space activity, no more launches, no more satellites or anything, the number of objects in space will increase exponentially. Because the collision between two bits of waste, that's the Kessler syndrome, that's the movie Gravity. It's happening over 15 years instead of an hour and a half, but it summarizes it very well. And there's no solution. Oh, you need to condemn some areas. Now, frankly, between 750 and 1100 kilometers, for instance, there's an orbital area that's rotten. You shouldn't go there anymore because the risks for satellites are too high. There's the golden orbit at 807 kilometers, SSO 98.7 degrees, which was that of SPACE, ERS 117. It's over. We're not doing that. Because on this orbit, there's 1,000 times more debris than satellites. So now operators have shifted. They go above that, like OneWeb, or below that. But to go below that, you need to cross it. Well, crossing is not a problem. The problem is really the integer of probability over time. If you're just passing through, it's okay. If you decide to spend a few years there you run into problems. That means that either you leave areas behind, but that's just a short-term solution because those rotten areas are gradually going to pollute the whole area. Or you can change techniques and saying that we no longer have any space telecommunications, only fiber or cables. Our friend yesterday would be very happy, but he explained that it's difficult too. And that's really the trendy issue we're going to clean up. Weirdly clean up. We've been working on that for 20 years. Active debris removal. It's paradoxical. You just need to remove about 10 big bits of debris every year to stabilize things. There are thousands up there, but just remove 10 a year. And so everybody's deciding on their solutions. You have a solution, you have things, don't you? But this is a very active issue where we don't really yet have a working solution. We need to find to work the finances out. Well, there is a solution that works, but it's not yet been proven. There will be demonstrators. But then there's one thing, coming back to what Édouard was saying earlier, one thing you should never forget that's absolutely fundamental, 97.5% of debris in LEO is caused by US, Russia, and China. So we'll send them the bill. But it's difficult to discuss with Russia and China. It's not trivial. So the biggest number one priority is international communication, to share about our worries, to share about regulations and the vision that we have. We are very proud that recently we published an article with the list of the 50 priority debris, the biggest ones, an article with the Russians, the Chinese, and so on. So the Russians said that, yes, out of 50, 30 bits of debris are Russian. So yes, that's progress. Julien, amongst the solutions, there's yours and there are others. Could you give us an overview of what is possible? Well, in 3 areas. The first solution, the solution is behavioral. There's a lack of interest by the industry. So Space Ethics Coalition, the Paris Peace Forum, forces to work alongside some principles. But then regarding litigation, there's liability for fault. There are areas where we can use in gross negligence in customary law. There are categories we can use in arbitration. So we are working on standards, and so Christophe at IEDC is working on that, or at ISO. So we all need to play the same game, which is about good behavior, to act as good Samaritans in space. Second thing, that's where I'm optimistic. There's a lot of innovation. What seems fairly obvious to me is that we will need to see smaller details more clearly. So there's an international race to have lethal non-trackable debris. Now we're fighting to see 1 to 2 centimeters. It was 10 centimeters in the past. Look at debris, whether it's dangerous or not. So with a big telescope, yes, using wide field cameras, and then with a telescope you can track it. So we can reach to 2 centimeters with wide field, wide angle infrared cameras. So see clearly smaller details. We can even see details of 10 millimeters in space, so 100-fold increase in resolution. We also need to predict better. Here we're talking about deep learning. It's difficult to understand the sun, but with deep learning, we can sort of predict 6 or 7, 8 hours ahead of time. So where the debris will be in 8 hours? No, predicting electromagnetic storms so that on the ground we can switch off infrastructure before it's impacted. There's a 30-minute lag between a storm on the sun and the moment it reaches the earth. And we need to certify these data. It's very important, especially for insurers. Certify that what you saw is indeed the thing that we're talking about. So here there are cryptographic technologies or data joining technologies. So predict, observe, predict, and certify. Christophe was talking about ADR, active debris removal. There are a lot of things we can do to observe and move things. And thirdly, what's very important, once you've reduced the risk, you need to be able to insure residual risk. When you're in GEO, you have a $400 million satellite and 95% reliability. It's okay. It's great. When you're in LEO, we haven't talked about it yet, but there's Moore's law. Everybody will try to do things 100 times cheaper, so smaller, more fragile, and we'll have a solar peak in 2025. It will be even riskier. Once you've reduced the risk, you need to insure the residual risk. And that's a third way for the industry. We are giving health bulletins to see details of 10 millimeters on any asset in a constellation. So an insurer can draft a policy to assess these premiums. So we need to work on regulation. We really need to work on pure tech to improve performance. And we also need to create new services. And we thought that there's something we can do to create something around life in orbit, not just launch or launch plus one, but really life in orbit. And for that, insurers need innovative analyses. And so that's something we can see very quickly. So these are 3 ways of innovation. And what's great in the current period, and that's why I'm quite optimistic, with AI, with crypto, there are quantum leaps happening. And so space used to be a non-issue, both because there was little risk. Satellites were very expensive in LEO. And between us, we couldn't see anything. And when you can't see anything, you think everything's okay. Now things are going to get harder. There will be accidents and a solar peak. And so it's about who's got the right information to tell things apart. So in the next 3 to 4 years, there's more than 50% chance of coming back to normal. Indeed, we'll have 100,000 assets traveling at 25,000 kilometers per hour at 600 kilometers, but risk becomes residual and insurable. And so the space industry, the space insurance industry will be able to manage that thanks to all this technological advance. Édouard, how is insurance experiencing it? Are you more and more serene? Well, we don't want to be mere observers. We want to play our role as insurers. We are risk management professionals. So for space, as Julien explained, there's a lot of innovation. We are used to ensuring non-standard missions, not just standard geostationary spacecraft. So our mission is to support the industry. But then we're not a sponsor either for the industry. We need to find the right balance to ensure these innovative solutions and at the same time take up the challenges that we're facing regarding market volatility. I talked about it earlier, the overriding trend in industry and ensuring new space that's sort of disrupting the market. When it comes to solutions, a quick response. Well, there's the technological aspect. Maybe in the design of some satellites, we can think about how to further improve spacecraft design. But then really the key on international consensus and getting everybody around the table to discuss. We're talking about Russia, China, the US. Well, you've named all three for geopolitical reasons. It's not so obvious, but I'm optimistic because space is an area of cooperation. If you look at the ISS, there are things that can escape what's going on the ground in terms of geopolitical tensions. So yes, this is going to be interesting to monitor. Now coming back to something that Christophe mentioned very quickly. I don't know, I'm probably watching too many TV shows, but it's fascinating. When you were talking about eliminating debris, at least 10 big pieces, very concretely, on a TV show, you would have a crane picking it up and bringing it back down to earth. Well, absolutely, nobody thought about a crane, so you could file a patent. Yes, but concretely, what can we do? We've worked a lot on big fishing with harpoons, nets, or grappling hooks. You're joking? No, absolutely not. There were in-flight demonstrations, but then the real question is who's going to pay? Well, be careful when talking about removing debris. We're talking about big debris. These are Russian Zenith rockets, so 9 tons, 9 meters, like a bus. And there are 22 on orbits that are very close to one another and crossing each other at less than 100 meters once a month. So the question is, we absolutely need to remove them before a collision, a head-on collision would double the number of debris immediately. But then who's paying? And so the Russians said, well, don't touch that. That's our property. That's our debris. Don't touch that. And they said, that's not debris because we're using that to calibrate our telescopes and radar, so they serve a function, so it's not debris. And then they said, well, of course, you can remove them, just pay them. Just pay us. So we're developing techniques. The only way to finance all this is probably by in-orbit servicing. So that's something that's really rising now with Space 4.0 that we were talking about. So it's having a service van. So on a Monday, refueling a satellite, on a Tuesday, moving another, and then on Sunday, to follow international regulations, you'll deorbit in the South Pacific. And then you tell them, well, when you're deorbiting, please capture the nearest debris. That's theoretically possible. Yes, it will be possible. In 2026, you'll have these first demonstrators. There's a demonstrator being financed and demonstrated. So ClearSpace, the Swiss, said, well, we're a very clean nation, so we'll be the first to do that. So they're developing a small space robot, a kind of crab, that will grab a real bit of debris, not too big to begin with, but real debris, and deorbit it. And they're expecting to do that in the contract. It's 2025, realistically 2026, maybe 27. But the technology already exists. There are life extensions for end-of-life spacecraft, so you will graft on a new spacecraft, bring it to the desired orbital position, and keep it in position because it's run out of fuel, but the rest is working well. All the onboard electronics work well, so you keep it in orbit, and once you've extended its lifetime, the new satellite can take it to a graveyard orbit, and this is something we're already doing. There were 2 MEV launches. So in the 50s, you sent lasers to push satellites. Does it work? There's a lot of technology being developed. What's new is the paradigm shift. In the past, you developed standards and wondered whether you could monitor or do things. What the Americans have shown, we were talking about MEV, in-orbit servicing. So we can do that for specific missions. So for France 2030, we'll have an inspection mission by the CNES in 2025. So we're doing things, and then we can develop standards. There's lasers, there's grappling, hooks, nets, any number of things. But what's interesting is that there's probably roughly 20 interesting missions that are going to take place. We are a partner of ClearSpace, so it's great if they can do that. And so there will be solutions tested between 25 and 27 on key elements of in-orbit servicing.
We're reaching the end of this roundtable, so if you were to summarize in one word or one sentence the way that one should clean space, what would you say? Multiplying such events, quite simply. Thank you so much for inviting us and for shedding a light on other topics. This is something that I've been advocating for since 1987. Okay, there you go. And we can only make progress by understanding the issue, by understanding the problem and thinking together about solutions. So thank you so much for your excellent initiative. And it's quite a pleasure to see Michel, with whom we've worked for more than 20 years on such topics. Julien, final word. Thank you so much as well for organizing this event. If I were to summarize what I think of this, well, we need international consensus with all stakeholders around the table, public and private operators, to have that sustainable space, to have a space in which we can still undertake space operations, and also with insurance companies who are here to propose new solutions to European or international institutions, and we want to play our role as an insurer on risk transfer. I'm very optimistic, so I think there have been considerable technological and scientific advances by non-space players with solutions which are much more scalable, and so I think there will be a very fruitful cooperation between all stakeholders. So I would wish for us to create new insurance models. There's lots of revenue on the horizon for insurers here, and there can be reliable deep tech solutions applied to a space. So let us test these new insurance solutions for a market accounting for 360 billion euros today, 1 trillion by 2040, with perhaps up to 100K satellites. There is a potential market, and the community should be involved. Thank you so much to the three of you for allowing us to dream on this morning. Thank you.